Hi guys, my name is Josh Hanna, and I'm going to be talking today about the Berlin Wall's effect on food and basically the differences in West Germany cuisine and East Germany cuisine and how the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall affected that kind of cuisine on each side of the wall. Basically, the introduction is I want to show how the wall really took a big effect on food from after World War II all the way up until modern day, and how even the wall still has an effect on food in Germany on this day. Go to this next slide. Quick history lesson. I have a map on the right here of Berlin during the Cold War, and it basically shows how it was divided between the Allied powers. Soviet Russia having a lot of this, and basically it was divided up into four sections. And of course, the Berlin Wall is going to be right in the middle and all along the sides of the Allied power, which is America's sector, British sectors, and the French sector, which basically didn't really allow for that much food to come in and out of this section of Berlin. And in this graphic I'm showing you on the right, it shows the US kind of supplying West Berlin since it was so cut off from the rest of Germany, kind of dropping in supplies like flour and other things. And the West side was observing capitalism at the time, whereas East side of Germany and Berlin was observing communism. Since Russia was already riddled with so much poverty across all the Baltic and Soviet nations, it was really hard for East Germany to rebuild since it also remained in poverty like most of the USSR controlled countries. Common German food on the west side of Germany and the west side of Berlin was the common things you think of when you think of Germany, being bratwurst, things like schnitzel and pretzel, and of course, beer. And it was very common since this side of the country was a lot more wealthy than the east side of Germany, and it was really funded by the US at the time, and it really allowed for the west side of Germany to flourish and kind of grow back its roots to where it was previously before the Nazis had taken it over. On the eastern side of Germany, on the other hand, they had a lot more meat-based meals, and they didn't have the luxury of choosing the different kinds of meats that they had or the different kind of supplies they had since it was all communist backed. And a lot of Germany and the Soviet Unions, like I was saying in the past slide, were in poverty at the time. So they had things like here on the right, which is kind of a meatball dish, and there's the pronunciation on the bottom of the German word on the bottom. It's Königsberger Krebse. I definitely pronounced that wrong, but it's basically a meatball made with different kinds of meat, kind of whatever they could find at the time. And it was also had things like potatoes on the side, which allowed for this to be a really hearty meal and have good nutrition with it. And then another German food that was kind of imported from Russia at the time is solyanka, which was a combination of like leftover food and meat that you had around the house that you could kind of mix up into a really hearty stew, often having a meat and having a lot of spice in it, allowing it to be a kind of spicy dish that was very common since it had to be really nutritious since a lot of Eastern German people at the time had a lot of working class families, and that was kind of all across the USSR. So this was a staple kind of stew in East Germany and all across the Balkans and the USSR at the time. And the next section, of course, I'm going to be talking about is fast food and kind of the difference is on each side of the wall and East and West Germany. So it was interesting to look at and see that McDonald's came 19 years before to West Germany in 1971. They opened in Munich, and it was really praised by the West German people because, of course, observing capitalism, you see McDonald's as a big franchise, and it was really interesting to see this come in to Germany at this time. And it was 19 years later that one finally opened up in East Germany, being in the town of Plauen. I believe that's how you pronounce it. And it was really interesting because the east side of Germany and kind of the east side of the Europes were interested to see how McDonald's was because it's kind of embodies capitalism, and a lot of the communist backing of politicians didn't really like the idea of McDonald's opening in East Germany at the time. And another interesting fact is that during this time, of course, we know the terminology hamburgers, and it's kind of a global thing to us to call something like a meat patty a hamburger. But in the East, they called it grilletas, which was basically to stop people from thinking about American capitalism. And it's really interesting to see that a lot of different things that the US made popular and named were changed in the East to kind of stop people from thinking about capitalism. So I found that really interesting. And then on to condiments. So the common thing in West Germany was to use kind of ketchup and mustard and all this stuff on their hamburger like a normal person in the Americas would. But in East Germany, they didn't have the luxury of having ketchup. So oftentimes they would have mustard or horseradish on their things as condiments. And they would also substitute ketchup for chutney, which is not exactly like a ketchup, but it was more of a relish kind of consistency. And of course, chutney can be used in many different things, but it could be used on hamburgers as well if they made it with tomatoes, which was really interesting to see. I didn't really think that the ketchup was a kind of American thing, but reading about it, didn't really think that Eastern Germans didn't really have an option to use ketchup at the time. And now on to the big part, which is the current effect that Germany is still facing nowadays with that effect of having the Cold War and the Iron Curtain in place. So Germany on the east side is still kind of trying to catch up with the western side of Germany, even politically and even with their monetary value and currency. A lot of the right side or the western side of Germany is still in poverty, so they still eat kind of some of these dishes, and those main meals like bratwurst and beer are more commonly still found on the western side, which is a really more kind of flourishing side of the country, which is really interesting to see. And it's still major differences from food, of course, in East and West Germany. They still eat a lot of common kind of USSR kind of based meals. And I was reading that a lot of restaurants in East Germany are still kind of GDR based, which was kind of a Soviet based food, and it still has a lot of influence. And even when you go online and look up East German food, a lot of it is still Soviet based food, and having restaurants that are still based on Soviet foods and kind of that cuisine that was commonly found during the Cold War. And basically, in summary, finding a lot of this stuff really interesting, and there was a really big impact for that time span that the Iron Curtain and kind of the Berlin Wall were up, and it still has a really big effect on Eastern Germany. And I just found it really interesting to see how East Germany is kind of trying to catch up with everything and kind of come back into the current world that we have right now in East Germany, which is kind of a more flourishing capitalist kind of world, which what Germany currently is nowadays. And that was pretty much it. Thank you guys for listening. Here were my sources for a lot of the pictures and articles and kind of German cuisine that was found at the time.